Ghost ships are more common than you think. But don't get excited. Only takes one mistake for a boat to get loose from port in a storm, and there are millions of yachts all over the world. A well-made ship can float on ocean's currents for years, so long as it stays away from any rocks. It can be decades before it ever crosses paths with someone. Most boats have an AIS on them, little signals that let the world know who you are and what you're doing. A smart owner will also have a GPS. When ships get loose, the owners usually contact the Coast Guard and they'll go and pick them up. But sometimes, for whatever reason, the beacon might not work, or the owners might not have had them on there. In these situations, you'll only know if you're close to one of those things when they pop up on the radar. I've had this happen once, and unlike most lost ships, it hadn't been because of a storm. It was a yacht that had been owned by a family holidaying in Thailand. They'd gone out for a short trip, logged it with the harbor, and then never came back. There was a search, but no sign of them was found. 6 years and a couple thousand miles later, I saw the Sun-Kissed float into view, emerging from the cold morning vapor like a ghost in the fog. I knew it wasn't man from the way that it moved, the way that its wooden bones creaked mournfully in the cold and damp. When I reported it, the Coast Guard gave me the bad news about the boat's circumstances, told me that I had to moor with it and wait till someone came to pick it up. This wasn't just lost property. There were grieving relatives out there waiting to hear news of what had happened to this missing family. I had an obligation. Now, I didn't want to. Something awfully sad about a lost boat, but the Sun-Kissed felt somehow worse than that even from afar. The sails lay unfurled on deck, all bundled up like bodies in the morgue, fabric lifting gently in the breeze. I tethered my own ship to it and climbed down, listening to the unnerving silence of a perfectly calm sea. Below deck looked like a war zone. Smashed plates, tables snapped in half, ceiling panels were loose. I wondered if the boat had gotten tossed around inside a tornado. Maybe the family had gone overboard all at once. But when I checked the master bedroom, the door had been wedged shut. It opened just enough to let me know that it wasn't locked, but that was it. And so I went and I found a window that let me look inside. Someone had piled everything they could find up against the door. They had even used random bits of wood to reinforce the barricade. But there was no sign of who had done it. Just an empty room with no way in and no way out. The only thing of note was a bedsheet they draped across one wall and painted the image of a house onto. It looked like a manor with a tower. One lone window all at the top all lit up. The house itself was painted so it sat on top of rows of wavy lines, making it look like the house somehow floated on water. It was a strange addition to an already extremely strange situation, and something about it got under my skin. And I went back to the door and kicked the hell out of it until the whole thing broke down and I could get in. And the stink was terrible. Sickly sweet but rancid. Like a moldy apple core you find crawling with wasps. To step inside, I had to push my way through a shin-high pile of old clothes and plastic bags full of bottled piss and excrement. The bed was done up like a nest, telling me that someone had lived there in squalor for God knows how long. But that begs the question, why? I wanted to know. No, I had to know. I found myself thinking that it was the picture that had answers, and I stared at it for longer than I'm comfortable admitting. Had the parents gone overboard in a storm and left the child behind? Was the picture just some kid's way of remembering their lost home? And when I reached out to touch it, something from behind it reached out and touched me in return. The effect was like the whole world dropped out from under my feet. I got so scared that I cried out and I fell over trying to get away. I tripped over festering sheets as my legs struggled to make sense of the panicking signals from my brain. One hand sank into something cold that was both dry and wet. But I didn't bother stopping to check what it was. I ran like hell, breath hitching in my chest like a toddler trying to control their sobbing. Even as I climbed my way back on deck, I kept telling myself that it was the wind that had moved the sheet. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the impression that there had been a dark shadow behind the light linen fabric. Something had reached out towards me. A child's hand. But of course, that was impossible. I figured I'd just let my nerves get the better of me, but the second that someone in a position of authority arrived, I got the hell out of there. It wasn't until a few years later that I heard the story of the Tillist House, so named for the island that it had once presided over from the lofty heights of the Hebridean Cliff. I'd taken on a job tutoring rich kids who wanted to learn sailing, and was busy working with an 18-year-old named Carl. He was in dire need of help getting his qualifications with the RYA to try and improve his personal statement. It was his gap year, and his last round of university applications had gone pretty badly. In return for letting him aboard my own yacht, his parents were willing to pay me a hefty bit. Surprisingly, his father also paid for a cook to join us. Now, he was a strange addition, especially since I'm used to sailing either alone or as a pair. But he was damn good at his job, and I appreciate the warm meals. They'd fallen out of the favor with the crown, he told me casually while frying an omelet one morning. Happened to a lot of the noble families, so the island was seized and given to military. But that old goat who ruled the roost refused to give up the family home. In a final act of spite, he used every last penny left of the coffers to have the house shipped, whole and intact, from Scotland to America. What? Like they took it apart brick by brick and just put it back together on the other side? Carl had asked. Nah. The cook grinned at me like he was telling a joke. They dug up its foundations and slid the house onto a barge waiting by the coast. Hundreds of men worked day and night for months to try and do it. What happened? It sank. The cook burst into laughter. The family was ruined. The father moved out and penniless to America and faded into obscurity. He laughed again and served us our food. But later that night, I did my own research and found a photo of the house as it left shore. It looked like most stately homes, only it had been dragged down a hill and placed, as if by magic, onto an enormous barge. That alone was weird enough, but what really kept me staring was the tower. Even in the grainy black and white sepia photo, I could tell that it was lit up from within. A house floating on water, with a single tower and a lit-up window. It was 12 months ago when Carl reached out to me. He didn't want more lessons, but he did want some help sailing to America. He knew that I spent most of my time over there and I was experienced at making the crossing. For whatever reason, he didn't want to make it a family trip and needed someone to act as a guiding hand. I got the sense that some tension had risen between him and his parents, but it was none of my business. The only caveat was that he had a girlfriend that he wanted to come along. She was new to sailing, and he didn't want to risk that long of a journey without someone else experienced on hand. And I agreed. I found him to be a good enough sailing companion in the past, and the pay was good. Not long after, I was joined by Carl and Alice for a 6-month journey to Canada, which would be followed by a short itinerary south to warmer waters in the USA. My plan was to drop them in the Caribbean, where they'd spend a few weeks and then fly back home just before the weather turned. The ocean crossing was mostly uneventful. Carl and Alice had a few minor arguments. The boy considered himself a hard worker, but Alice had been looking for more of a relaxing adventure. He thought that she was lazy, but in my opinion, she just wasn't happy bobbing along in the empty water with little to do or see. It isn't a hobby that suits everyone. The arguments weren't big, but there was a few days where she spent her time sulking below deck with a book, while Carl tried his best to make small talk with me about things like his new job as a paralegal or the opinions of idiots on social media. Despite having little in common, Carl didn't bother me too much. He was young and well-meaning. Still, I really wished that I had been with someone else during that trip. After all, it was Carl who insisted that we borrow the Tillist house. The sea was calm when we saw it. Alice was sitting on the bow of the ship with her legs curled up and a book in her lap. Carl was down below, working on something for his job. It had been a few days with no wind, so we were stuck using the motor. It was busy dwelling on the unpleasant sound of the engine and the smell of diesel when Alice suddenly called out, "Is that a lighthouse?" This is a fairly alarming thing to hear when you finally mentally positioned yourself nearly 1,000 miles from the coast that you're aiming for. First thing I did was check the navigation computer in the cabin, which confirmed that we were in the middle of the Atlantic. And barely a moment later, Carl appeared with a furrowed brow. "It can't be," he said, followed by a glance my way to confirm. I then climbed on deck and found Alice by the gunwale with her hand shielding her eyes from the sun. I followed her gaze and I tried to peer through the morning mist that was fast evaporating beneath the heavy sun. And when her eyes aligned to the tower that rose slowly above the horizon, I was filled with a terrible disquiet. It was a silent shape that seemed to emerge from the very water. They were long minutes spent staring, as neither us nor the strange object were moving at high speeds. Instead, we trundled towards each other in a lazy crawl. Even when it had crested the horizon and the entirety of it was in view, I couldn't quite accept what my eyes were telling me. I could only struggle with the growing apprehension that I felt. And in the end, it was Carl who broke the silence, standing there like statues watching a house float our way. "Is that a fucking house?" Alice laughed at his words, but when her eyes passed mine, she seemed uncomfortable with the sight. I couldn't blame her. The sight of it filled me with dread. "It is a house." And then he turned to me. "The Tillist house. It has to be." I filled Alice in on the legend as Carl reached to grab a pair of binoculars. After he spent a few moments gawking at the house, I took them and I looked for myself. The windows were dark, the front door closed. Bizarrely, the barge was filled with what looked like dead plants. Ferns and bushes turned brown and wilted, arranged in pots and planters like it was just an everyday backyard. And the house itself was far more intact than it had any right to be. The windows were filthy and the roof tiles were missing in places, but the damn thing shouldn't have been standing at all. The rubber on the barge's drums should have failed decades ago. The wood should have rotted, the chains should have rusted, and the ropes should have snapped. I could have listed a dozen more points of failure, all of which should have passed long before I was even born. All of which meant that the house and the barge ought to be long underwater. But this was my rational mind protesting. Deep down, I knew that the house was real. Or real enough. It was a forgotten thing far outside most people's attention. And who knows what happens in the unseen corners of the world. And the sea is full of places far outside anyone's sight. The house floated in spite of rationality, and no amount of my worrying could change that. And at some point, it even slowed down. It was Carl who had the sense to get behind the helm and take control in case things hadn't gone so smoothly. I could only stand, frozen in terror as half my eye line was taken up by the ever-growing spectacle of a 3-story manor house. A creaking, groaning monstrosity made of wood, brick, and plaster that twisted in strange buttresses and extensions that defied any kind of architectural planning. Only when its timber frame groaned with exertion and its velocity slowed to a crawl and it finally, agonizingly bumped against my own yacht, did some part of me decide that it was time to leave. I tried to collect myself, look around, and briefly tried to think of a plan. I had just figured out that I'd tell Carl to hit reverse when I saw a flash of color in the corner of my eye. He had climbed the rails and jumped onto the barge. "What the fuck do you think you're doing?" Allison screamed the words just as her boyfriend turned and gave her a big grin and a thumbs up. He must have heard her, but he clearly wasn't interested in the warning. "It's fine," he cried while securing the lines between the two vessels. "What are you scared of?" Alice looked at me as if I might offer up some kind of answer that wouldn't sound insane, but I struggled. The mere sight of him on the floating island was like a shock to the system, like driving by a tall building and glimpsing something hanging off of the edge of a high window. Most of what my brain kept telling me was along the lines of, "Get away from it, because the damn thing shouldn't exist." "It might not be safe," I eventually cried. "It could sink at any moment." "If it is the Tillist house, it's been around for 100 years, he replied. Why would it sink now? Because you're fucking trampling all over the damn thing. Carl, please just come back. Growing annoyed with the both of us, Carl sighed and poked a thumb towards the house. I gotta look. I just gotta. He was halfway to the door when I realized that he wasn't gonna stop unless I did something. Finally stealing my nerves, I climbed the railing and found that, once I started taking some kind of action, it got a little easier. Pretty soon, I was jumping down into the strange wooden beams of the barge where I quickly noticed the thin layer of algae slime that made them as slippery as ice. I had only taken a few careful steps when Alice cried out, "Carl!" And I looked up to see the front door open and the young man nowhere in sight. "Don't worry," he cried out from somewhere within. "Guys, you gotta check this out. It's kind of creepy in here." And his words were cut off when the door slammed shut and there was only the sound of sloshing water and Alice's growing screams. "Get him! You gotta go get him!" Alice continued to beg me to hurry, but I took my time approaching the door. That place was an unknown and it sat strangely on the senses. An old wooden deck covered in ancient potted plants and even a goddamn bench. Like I was just walking on my grandmother's patio. Before I reached the door, I quickly glanced through the nearest window and saw a dust-covered living room in that busy pre-war style you might sometimes still find in the houses of centenarians. Every surface caked with dust so thick that nothing of the furniture's original colors could be seen. The air was alive with the stuff, eddies of it whirling in the sunlight rays interrupted by my own shadow. But there was no sign of Carl. Not a single hallway with an open doorway. And the shadows beyond as black as printed ink. Taking a deep breath, I pressed onto the door that I had just reached for the handle when it was snatched from my hands and Carl stumbled towards me. I cried out in fear, not just as the suddenness of his appearance, but the way that he came out of the dark with wide eyes and pale skin. He looked more like a corpse than the lively young man that I'd been looking at just moments ago. He was clutching his one fist in the other, squeezing tight around 3 bloodied stumps where there was nothing above the knuckles. Blood dripping down his trousers and stomach and somehow coated most of his face and chin. I barely managed to utter some kind of question when he collapsed forward into my arms and we were both sent falling towards the floor. I did my best to catch him, but the impact was so hard on us both. I hurt my back and he rolled off me, grunting in pain as he moved onto the wounded side. I quickly regained my feet and began helping him upright. I had one arm under his when he tensed up, freezing like a man terrified. His eyes had fixated on the door behind us. It had been left ajar, open no more than an inch. And slowly the handle turned, and the door closed with terrifying deliberacy. We had left immediately, and the house followed. We had motored away nearly half a mile when the barge, creaking and groaning like a terrifying monster of the deep, began to glide after us. Carl screamed as this happened, even though he was below deck at the time. I might have wondered how it was possible he knew what was happening, but I felt it too. Felt the gaze of that thing upon us. My heart had raced for hours afterwards, even after I had set our course and climbed down to find Alice gently stroking the shivering face of her boyfriend. I looked around for something that might help us, but there was nothing that I could do. Instead, I sat anxiously and listened as Carl finally stopped screaming and began to mutter a peculiar but haunting phrase. She had no choice. She had no choice. She had no choice. Nothing I did could get him to stop, and while Alice was committed to staying by his side, I struggled to ignore his desperate whispers. They wormed their way beneath my skin and added greatly to the panic I fought to control. After deciding there was nothing for me down there, I returned to the cabin and stared at the sea behind us, lit pink and purple from the setting sun. I did my best to ignore the silhouette of the house as it trundled in our wake and instead focused on the radio, which I used to try and call for help. But the handset did not respond the way that it ought to. Picking it up, I received no signal whatsoever. Turning to the right frequency, I set out an SOS anyway, hoping to hell that someone nearby might be able to come help. We had an injured party, I had said. We needed medical assistance right away. And for a long time, there was no response. I began to wonder if the handset was even switched on when suddenly the speaker burst to life. The voice was small and breathy, like a child who had spent a long time running or possibly even hiding for their life. The words themselves, however, were very familiar.
She had no choice. She had no choice. She had no choice.
I took an early shift sleeping. Figured I'd wake up around midnight and keep an eye on things while Alice and Carl slept through until morning. At first I thought that I might find it hard to sleep. I was worried about what might happen if the house caught up to us, and my mind was racing with a million other questions about the logic of it all. But stress is a powerful sedative, and sleep came easier than I thought, leaving me in a dreamless slumber. And when I woke, there was a sense that very little time had passed, but the clock beside my bed had told me that it was 3 a.m. Any anger or frustration I felt at Alice forgetting to wake me up quickly dissipated as I sat up and the atmosphere of the yacht sank in. It was quiet. No motor, no flapping sails. No one was out there rustling around in the kitchen or the head. And I held my breath trying to listen more closely, but there was nothing. It was a long time that I stayed there, before the gentle lapping of a calming sea was finally broken by 3 heavy footfalls from the deck above. They were slow and deliberate, and I couldn't work out where they started and led. But there was something unsettling about their rhythm, as they told me nothing about who made them or why. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen before raising my head above the hatch. It was pitch black out there. No moon. Only stars and the filmy reflection of the seemingly infinite ocean. With the engine off and the battery dying, the lights in the cabin no longer worked and I had to rely on a flashlight to slowly scan the deck. But it was empty. No sign of who had been stomping around up there, even though only minutes had passed since I heard them. I dropped back down below and looked around for Alice and Carl, but the cot where Carl had lain just hours ago, babbling and whimpering as his girlfriend tended to his savaged hand, was now a knot of bloodied, empty sheets. A cup lay knocked over by the floor, and I couldn't help but imagine some kind of struggle to explain how I'd gotten there. But that told me little about where anyone was. My first priority was to get power back up, but I soon found that the keys to the engine were missing. And worse yet, the spares were gone too, even though they had been kept in a locked drawer by the navigation table. Someone had opened it with no muss or fuss, either guessing or somehow knowing the combination to the lock that I used. Accepting that I was stuck in the dark, I began to look for Carl and Alice using the flashlight. There were only 5 compartments on that yacht, and I checked each one, and then, driven by a growing sense of panic, I checked them again. And then, just to be sure, I checked one more time. I circled the quarters, opening doors and whispering, and then crying, and then shouting for this hideous joke to stop. But no one came to help. I returned to the deck and I searched there, but there were only a few blood streaks leading to the aft of the boat. I looked overboard, gazing anxiously at the water around me. Had they gone overboard? I tried peering deep into the water below, but there was only darkness down there. And then I scanned the distance, but my only light struggled against the immense blackness of the moonless night and reached only 10 or 20 feet in any direction. The sea was maddeningly calm. It was larger than all of the continents and deeper than any skyscraper. It seemed impossible that I could find myself looking at ocean water where the waves didn't even break, but instead they rolled lazily like the sloshing in a paddling pool. The sea offered not even so much as a breeze to help me get going, because that was all I needed. Just a bit of wind. With that, I could get myself to busier waters and find real help. But without wind or an engine, I was stuck, drifting. And what of Carl or Alice? The dinghy that served as a lifeboat was still secured to the aft. If they had left the yacht, they'd done so by swimming. That was surely an insane thing to do. But Carl hadn't exactly seemed himself towards the end either. And for a moment I entertained the question, where had they gone? But that was a stupid thing to do. No sooner had I slumped into the captain's chair and let myself think the words than the answer came to me unbidden. Instinctively, I turned my eyes towards the part of the horizon I'd been avoiding. The house was dark against the blue-black horizon, and nearly impossible to see silhouette that anyone could have missed had they not known what to look for, as if it had been waiting. As soon as I looked its way, the light at the top of the house's tower had come on. When I climbed aboard the barge once more, my light caught flashes of the barren garden with its dried and dying plant life. Chalky fingers reached towards me from the dark. I moored the dinghy and ignored them, but could not ignore the solitary shoe that lay waiting closer to the house's front door. It was Alice's trainer, and the normally yellow and white trainer was soaked in blood that appeared black in my dim light. I considered calling out for her, but I couldn't quite summon the courage to break the silence. Still, there was no mistaking the path of dripping blood that traced its way from the shoe towards the open door. Terrified as I was, I felt as if I had no choice. Circumstance was holding me hostage, and I could return to the yacht, but I doubted that any wind would come to whisk me away. Instead, my thoughts turned to the ghost ship that I had boarded all those years before. Had the child on board seen their parents disappear into the same open door that awaited me? Had they been left, stranded on that boat? And if so, for how long? Days? Weeks? Months? It didn't matter. There had been no easy escape for them either, had there? The scenario played out so clearly in my mind. They had hidden away while something tore the yacht apart, and eventually it had gotten them, leaving only a ruined boat and a long-forgotten shelter. There was never going to be any magical rescue. My only real chance was to find Carl and get the keys that he had taken. And I had a pretty good idea where he was. Opening the door felt like poking a web, knowing the spider that made it is hiding deeper in the funnel. And as it swung open, it revealed a small vestibule filled with what must have been nearly 50 or 60 shoes, all piled up on one side. I couldn't help but notice Alice's other trainer was there, along with 2 deck shoes that I recognized from Carl's feet. And the strangest thing about that pile was that the way that most of the shoes had been placed in an orderly fashion, like they belonged to visitors, not victims. Beyond, I found a near pitch-black corridor, the walls covered in so many hanging pictures that most of them obscured the floral wallpaper beneath. They were so old that I couldn't see much of their subjects, except for one of the larger ones that had somehow avoided the worst of the decay. It showed the Tillist house atop a Scottish hill where its presence seemed a hell of a lot more appropriate. But it wasn't exactly benign either. The house was not as big as it was now, but something didn't look quite right either. And the family posing out in the front looked like a strange group. 3 girls, a mother and a father. The old man was smiling with a mustache that reached past his chin. But everyone else in the picture could have been attending a funeral based on the expressions that they held. It wasn't just your run-of-the-mill historical sadness. They looked deathly miserable. Grief-stricken women facing down a death sentence. There were a few doors along the corridor. One of them opened into the room that I'd spied the day before, the sitting room covered in heavy dust. It was no more inviting from the other side of the glass. What I hadn't been able to see before were the words scrawled across the same wall with the window. They had been carved into the plaster and wood, then dabbed over with something dark and brown. The effect was nightmarish. The words themselves offered even less comfort. She cut it loose. Whatever implement had been used, the wielder had driven it so far into the wall it made my skin crawl to think of the strength involved. Moving onwards, I found more places in a similar state. There was a dining room, and the plates smashed and thrown across the floor, and across the great oak table the words, "No world would be new if he was in it too." I found a library where the books had been ripped apart page by page. Someone had even draped a blanket across 2 chairs to make a kind of tent, and it was obvious from the burned books that they tried to light a fire. But based on the dust that caked everything, it must have been from a long time ago. Still, I could not shake the eerie feeling that I had gazing at the bundled pile of blankets beneath the little tent. I tried hard not to think of a similar nest that I had found on the ghost ship so long ago. It wasn't long before I decided that there was nothing for me on the ground floor, even if I had only explored half of it. It wasn't just that I didn't want to continue meandering around the labyrinth until I got lost. But when I finally encountered the stairwell, it was obvious from the scrapes and scuff marks in the dust that this was the only place that got any foot traffic. The stairs themselves were a tight spiral, the walls marked halfway up by scratch marks in the paint that made me think of hands scraping desperately for purchase. I climbed them carefully and found the next floor to be mostly bedrooms. They often appeared unremarkable at first glance, although there were often a few details that unsettled me if I lingered on them too long. One had a wardrobe filled with tally marks and urine stains. Another had long scratch marks beneath the bed, as if something or someone had been dragged out there with great effort. In another, there was a mound of broken porcelain dolls that covered the bed, reaching all the way to head height. But always, each time I pushed open a door, there was a great disturbance of dust that told me that no one alive had been there for a long time. Instead, I was often left with the impression that I was exploring some kind of mausoleum, keenly aware that whoever owned the wigs or the old luggage stacked up against one wall or the crumbling dress that had been laid out neatly on the bed, they must be long dead. And then there was the writing. Much like the ground floor, I found wall after wall covered in short phrases etched into the very wood or stone of the house. She would rather sink it all. They were better off drowned than with him. The house did not sink. She tried to feed them, but they were starved first. Each one was a painful verse that tugged at the guilty conscience that was not mine, but which seemed to permeate every inch of that house. Many rooms had the same phrase repeated, and I tried my very best to remember the individual ones, but I must have explored 20 rooms on the first story alone, each one quiet and empty but haunted by a distant loss that I could not ignore. I often thought of the photo, of the smiling father and the miserable wife and daughters, and I remembered that in my research, the only real historical account of the house's sinking was that it had come loose in a storm and the father had arrived alone in America where he quickly drank himself to death. I tried to imagine what kind of man he must have been. He had ruined his family financially just to move his house from one end of the world to another. And that photo? I figured him stubborn, maybe even spiteful and vindictive. He stood in the photo smiling while his own wife and daughter scowled in the corner. I didn't get the sense that he had been unaware of them either. In a strange way, his expression seemed as if it wasn't just the house that he was showing off in the photo. He was almost proud of his family's misery. Had his wife cut the barge loose from its tow partway through the crossing rather than spend the rest of her life with him? It made a twisted sort of sense. But that was only part of the picture. She tried to feed them, but they starved first. I just found the next stairwell, and those words were pacing furiously around my mind when I was caught off guard by a door along one corridor swinging open just as I passed it. The motion was quite sudden and deliberate, as if the person on the other end knew exactly that I was coming. It was Carl, pale as a sheet and with one hand still dripping blood on the dusty floor. And he stared right through me as he lifted his hand to his face and bit slowly into the meat of his palm. And then with a mouth full of his own flesh, his eyes seemed to finally find me. She was so hungry. So hungry. First the storm cleared, and the barge did not sink. And then the food dwindled and no help arrived. She told them early on what to do when she passed. And Mother would make the sacrifice. The gods' cruel jokes were not over. It was them that grew weak first and not her. Them that passed slowly and painfully till it was only her alone in this house. Until it was only her alone in the house. Carl's eyes watered as he swallowed his own flesh and took another bite out of his forearm. I could not help but wince at the cookie-cutter imprint he left in his flesh, and the way the blood began to course upward with the rhythm of his beating heart. She tried not to, Paul, but hunger hurts in the end. She had no choice. With no real warning, he lunged towards me and drove his teeth into my neck. We slipped, and his bite tore strips of my skin before skipping off of my collarbone. I managed to stumble backwards out of Carl's grip and stay upright, but he kept going with the downward momentum and landing on his hands and knees. I touched my neck, and while the bleeding was profuse, the wound was not deep. I was lucky that he hadn't managed to get any real purchase, as he might have taken a chunk right out of my throat. Carl's head snapped in my direction from where he crouched, and there was a ravenous hunger burning within those bloodshot eyes. In a flash, I saw my future self lying there being eaten alive, and the terror drove me to flee just as he sprang forward and grabbed my ankle. I kicked backwards, and my heel caught his chin. There was a loud crack, but Carl seemed unfazed by the loss of 3 teeth and a dislocated jaw. Instead, his grip tightened, and he hissed a malformed but familiar phrase. "She'd no choice!" And I kicked him again, and then again, striking over and over until he finally loosened his grip and I was able to flee up the stairs. Carl did not follow me as I emerged into the enormous and open attic space. Instead, he remained below, alternating between hungry growls and an unsettling sound of wet chewing. I might have given more thought to what he was eating, but my attention was grabbed by the only 2 things in that empty space. The first was a wrought iron staircase that led into the tower above. It stood freely in the center of the dusty wooden floor, its metal steps lit bright by a strange and otherworldly light. Not far from the bottom step was Alice. She was facing away from me, but the ground all around her was pooled with blood. I spoke her name tentatively as I approached, but she did not react. Every step I took was filled with growing dread as I realized to my horror that she too was chewing, stuffing fistfuls of some strange wet substance into her mouth, sobbing quietly all the while. And when I circled her, I saw that she had been disemboweled and was stuffing her own innards in her mouth. Her teary eyes noticed me then and turned upwards in desperation and despair. "It hurts," she said, her words muffled by a full mouth. "God, it hurts so bad, but I can't stop." She reached a hand out to me and something red and wet slipped out of her palm and struck the dusty floor below. Are you hungry too? Do you feel it?" I would have spoken, but knew that to open my mouth would invite vomit. Instead, I shook my head and stepped backwards. "No," she muttered sadly. "No. You wouldn't, would you? She told me plain as day when she came to me." Alice looked down towards her own split stomach and sobbed again. "This hunger is only for parents." It was a dreadful realization that dawned on me as I gazed at her open stomach and followed a trail of splattered blood leading from her prone form to the nearby stairs. The unspoken tension between the couple suddenly made sense to me in that moment, as Alice had clearly been struggling throughout the journey with an unplanned pregnancy. I stepped away, but Alice made no effort to attack me. Instead, she continued her terrible feast, and I found myself seized by a powerful compulsion. I followed that thin trickle of blood, my heartbeat racing as I climbed the tower and left behind the tragic sounds of Alice's final fate. And at the very top, I found a small room lit bright by a powerful but impossible light, a kind of golden halo emanating from every window that had no obvious source, but which painted the occupants in a dazzling array of colors reminiscent of stained glass catching the sun. A silent tableau. A single chair with the withered corpse of a long-dead woman, mummified by the salty sea air. And lying around her feet, huddled close to the hem of her skirt, lay a dozen small children in varying states of decay. Some clutching closely to the fabric, others touched her feet. And I stared in horror, and I wondered if perhaps, among that gathering, lay crouched the body of a child who had once hidden in the depths of the sun-kissed which I had explored years before, snatched away and taken to this place after the parents had been driven mad by the house's terrible curse. And slowly the eyes of every child turned to look at me, their paper-thin skin wrinkling like old wrapping paper. And I was faced with a sea of unblinking eyes and rictus grins that bore receding gums and brown-chipped teeth. The world felt light beneath my feet. My stomach sank and all the blood rushed from my head to my toes, turning my scalp and neck to ice. And for a moment, time seemed to pause and I was aware only of the distant sobs of Alice and the gentle lapping of seawater that was almost perfectly still. I felt like an intruder bursting into the funeral of someone I didn't know. The crowded mourners turning to gaze at me in quiet but stunned disgrace. And I waited, rooted to the spot with terror, with something to break the interminable silence. Until, at last, something finally did. The old woman's body moved to look at me. She smiled, and I lost all consciousness. Someone carried me to the yacht and set me adrift. It wasn't Carl or Alice because I remember seeing both lying close to where I'd left them. Memories of something half glimpsed during my descent, I suppose. As for what carried me, I don't know. I don't think I want to know. In a strange way, it was like when you fall asleep as a child and wake up in your own bed, having been taken there by a parent. A terrible thing to admit, given what I had seen. But that's how I felt. Warm. I spent a few more weeks floating on that calm sea before the wind finally returned and I was back on the familiar choppy waters of the Atlantic. My radio began working not long after, and I was able to call for help. Unfortunately, I had little to say to anyone that would have sounded sane. With Carl and Alice both missing, I instead opted to clean the yacht of any signs of struggle and simply say that I went to sleep one night and awoke to find them both missing, having likely fallen overboard. Calmed and without a working radio, I was unable to make a distress call, and they were both lost and likely drowned. In a strange coincidence, my GPS beacon had gone on the fritz for a good 72 hours, and when they checked my location, it had me pinging around the globe, popping up in the Sahara for 15 minutes, then the Pacific for another 15, and so on. This helped corroborate my story of radio problems, and while I wasn't completely free of suspicion, there was enough water to my story that I avoided any actual charges. Not that anyone would trust me with tutoring novices in the future. Then again, it isn't something that I'd like to return to. In fact, I haven't been able to go near the sea since I got back, let alone step foot on a yacht. Every time I do, I remember what I saw clutched close to the bosom of that old, long-dead woman. It was a small, half-formed thing that she held in such tender arms. Alice's unborn child was no bigger than a kitten, and its fresh, bloodied skin glistening in the dazzling technicolor lights of that dreamlike tower. I remember the look of it so clearly. Just like I remember its first breath, the opening of its eyes, and the impossible wail that followed.